Panelist Miles Taylor previously worked as Chief of Staff at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. He's perhaps best known as the author of the anonymous essay published in the New York Times in September 2018 that blew the whistle on presidential misconduct. He later published the #1 bestseller, A Warning, in 2019, and revealed himself to be the anonymous author. And he launched a campaign of ex-officials to oppose Trump's re-election. He currently works as a national security expert in Washington, D.C., and published his latest book earlier this year titled Blowback, A Warning to Save Democracy from the Next Trump. Please welcome to the stage Miles Taylor. Our next panelist is Franklin Foer, a staff writer for The Atlantic and a former editor of The New Republic. He is the author of several books, including his most recent, published in September, titled The Last Politician: Inside Joe Biden's White House and the Struggle for America's Future. He created this definitive insider narrative of the first 2 years of the Biden presidency with extraordinary and exclusive access to Biden's longtime team of advisors. We're grateful to have this author back because he is returning. He was a panelist in our 2017 Symposium of Telling the Truth. Please welcome to the stage Franklin Foer. Thank you for coming to Albany. I know Franklin's been here, but Miles, have you been here before?
No, I'm a first-timer, so thanks for having me. Love this beautiful town, saw the Capitol, saw some other buildings. I hope to see more. No, it was lovely. Thanks for having us.
So in Albany, we always thought we were like the world leader in government dysfunction and corruption, but apparently Washington leads us in that category.
No, I can tell you about something worse.
We hope to get to that soon. So I'll start with Miles. You've been criticized and praised for your role as a whistleblower. Some people said you should have sounded the alarm earlier, and the MAGA crowd relentlessly attacks you as a traitor. So how did you come to that decision to write the anonymous essay, which was titled, I Am Part of the Resistance Inside the Trump Administration? What were the ground rules with the New York Times, and would you do it the same way all over again?
A lot of questions in there.
Take them one at a time.
Look, I'd say this. To the person who would criticize me for the decision I made, I would look at them and say, you're probably right. Let me tell you why. At the time, I had decided to go into the Trump administration as a lifelong Republican, after trying to make sure Trump didn't win the White House. I'd been working under Paul Ryan when he was Speaker of the House, never thought there was a chance Donald Trump could win the White House, but thought it was very important for us to prevent him from becoming the nominee, because in my mind, it would ruin the Republican brand for a generation, and we couldn't let that happen. But again, no way he was gonna win the White House. Made the decision to actively work to help Paul Ryan craft something called the Trump Inoculation Plan. And the reason you probably have never heard of that is because that plan failed catastrophically. We did a very bad job of that. Trump, of course, won. In any other time period, it would have been a dream moment for a young national security staffer like me to go into a Republican White House. And I started to get dream offers to go work in the Trump White House. I didn't have any interest in being anywhere near the guy. But then a mentor of mine, John Kelly, 4-star Marine General from U.S. Southern Command, decided to take a job as Secretary of Homeland Security. And he said to a group of us on Capitol Hill a few months into the administration, it's not nearly as bad as it looks inside. It is so much worse. That's literally what he said to us. And Kelly was as serious as a heart attack about it, and I took that seriously. And he was sending a signal, which was, it's genuinely very bad. The president's unstable, and we need people to make the decision to come in. I suspected that would be career suicide. It turned out to be the case, not in the way that I expected. And 18 months into the administration, working as, at that point I was Deputy Chief of Staff before becoming Chief at Department of Homeland Security, it was very evident who the President was. He was indeed as unstable as John Kelly thought, and I knew one thing to your question, which is that if I was going to telegraph that to the American people, which I felt like the cabinet secretary should have been doing. His cabinet members knew he was unstable, talked about invoking the 25th Amendment, and I thought if it's that bad, our oath of confidentiality inside this administration should probably be breached to tell the people who decide whether to fire or rehire the president. I made the decision to put that message out there anonymously because I knew that one thing, Donald Trump was a master at the politics of personal destruction, and that the best thing I could do is deprive him of the person to distract attention from the message and try to drive attention to the message. And I'm not comparing myself to these people, but that's what the Founding Fathers did with the Federalist Papers when they tried to sell the American public on the US Constitution. They hid their names not out of fear, but because they knew the personal politics of those guys at that time would distract from the philosophy they were trying to convey to the American people. I borrowed that tactic, and to your question about what I would have done differently, I'd always intended to come forward. I also was very clear-eyed that when I came forward, I knew it would be a nightmare for me. But I knew it was important to do, and it was important to do before re-election, because at some point, I needed to go out there and subject myself to you, and not just have the New York Times be the interface and say, trust us, he's seen this. I needed you to take a look and decide if you were going to trust me or not, and to have that conversation so I could give more vivid detail. What I would have done differently is I would have come forward sooner, because to my delight and my surprise, when I did come forward, all of the people I'd been trying to get to go to the front of the line ahead of me and to go speak out against the guy, and who largely said no, finally started saying yes to me. And we've all seen this phenomenon, something scary, bungee jumping. You go first, your friends are like, okay, it doesn't look so bad, I'll come bungee jumping. It was political bungee jumping. And I was so heartened that colleagues of mine decided to join me. I only wish we had started even sooner and built an even bigger coalition, because I see now that fear is still holding so many of my fellow Republican colleagues from that time period back from saying what they know to be true. Wish I had done it sooner. Zero regrets about doing it anonymously initially. I think it got the attention that it needed, but I regret that we're back in that moment again where we need other people to come forward.
Thank you very much. Franklin, I'll move to you. Yeah. Can you take us to the origin of this? How did you gain such extraordinary access to the Biden White House and its inner workings? What were the ground rules placed on you? Did you have to vet anything before you published your book? And why did you extend your reporting from your initial idea from 1 year to 2 years?
Thank you. So I was approached by my publisher to write a book about the first 100 days of the Biden administration in the summer of 2020. So right after he won, right after the Democratic convention. And I was a little bit reluctant to embark on the project because I'd never done a book that was like this, that required getting inside the room access. And also, even though I could identify with some parts of the project that the Biden administration was going to have to confront, rushing into government in the middle of a pandemic with the economy hanging off of a cliff, having to restore these broken institutions of government. Joe Biden was not somebody who I felt any real sense of connection with. I mean, he was always somebody I had thought of as a bloviator who dangerously fetishized bipartisanship. And so I thought about it. And I thought, okay, well, this is interesting. Like, I actually, if you know, the chance to have your face pressed up against the window of history, like that sounded like it could be an interesting thing. But I knew it was going to be a challenge. And so what I did before, just after the AP declared Biden the winner in November 2020, I had started calling around to people who I knew would be in top positions in the Biden presidency, asking them if they would have, if they would be my sources, basically. And I didn't know what that meant. They didn't know what that meant. And I just needed to get enough so that it felt like we had some sort of critical mass, so that my publisher felt like they could give me a book contract in good conscience, and then we could announce it to the world and stake a claim that we were doing this. And so a lot of it is faking it till you make it in our business. And some people fake it after they make it.
Don't associate me with that.
And so what at the beginning of well, first of all, so at the beginning of a presidency, people don't really want to talk to journalists because they're all afraid of getting fired for leaking. Not that you were a leaker.
We'll take a poll on that later.
You were a
We'll take
leaker.
a poll.
Yeah, right. You were a leaker through the front door. But so that was an issue. And then it's also, you have to learn how to separate. There's so much noise, so much of political journalism, the everyday headlines are just, it's ephemera, they're controversies that don't matter. And so you start to get a feel for what matters and what'll matter 2 years from now, 3 years from now, and what's just stupid noise that fills up cable news. And so as I went along, I knew, and I got to the first 100-day mark, I didn't have enough for a book because not enough had happened, and I knew that was going to be the case going in. But then Biden announced a couple things over the course of his first 100 days. He announced that he was going to withdraw from Afghanistan, which was clearly going to be a big deal. He announced that he was going to propose 2 big pieces of legislation, which were initially called the Jobs Plan and the Family Plan, one of which became the infrastructure bill, and the second became the $3.5 trillion in social spending that was going to be his expansion of the social safety net, which ultimately became the Inflation Reduction Act, which is, I think, an incredibly significant piece of legislation that never gets any love because it has a very banal name. But as I went along, one of the things that happens is if you show up, and what I tried to do was to ask earnest questions about policy, that if you're working in the White House or you're working in an administration, you're engaged in these substantive efforts to conquer in their instance, to conquer the pandemic, to script legislation, to script foreign policy. And what I found was if you just ask them about the substance as opposed to who's up or who's down or whatever the stupid controversies of the day, you're able to earn their trust that you're trying to understand them on their own terms, and they start to trust you with their story.
Right.
But nobody, I never had an access deal per se.
That's what I was wondering. Sometimes you got to trade control for access. You didn't have to with them? Did they have to see the draft at all?
No, they didn't see the draft. In fact, there was that day, I didn't show them, when I got hardcover copies of the book a week before it was published, I had to meet with the people who were kind of my handlers in the White House to give them a copy of the book. And it's one of these, it's a moment that fills a writer with both joy and dread because it's like it's the product, it's the fruit of your labor, but then you also know that they're going to sit and they're going to see things that they're going to be frustrated by or disappointed by, or nobody likes getting written about. And Joe Biden especially does not like getting written about.
It's a great cover, the iconic aviator glasses. Were you ever close enough to see yourself reflected in Joe's aviator glasses?
No, I can't say that I was.
All right, Miles, back to you. So in Blowback, you warn against the danger of Trumpism overtaking the Republican Party. You fear the emergence of a successor, the next Trump. You call it Trump 2.0. But it appears now that the biggest danger was the original Trump. Do you imagine someone among these GOP challengers overtaking him or anything changing in the next year, or will the original Trump be this Trump 2.0 that you fear most?
My editor gets heartburn about this every single day because we had a lot of debates as I was writing this, and I said, look, I'm very convinced he will be the GOP nominee. And we first started having this conversation about the book 2 years ago, when quite frankly, every single publisher in the industry said to me, no one wants to read another Trump book. No one wants this guy in their lives again, and he's probably going to be in jail and he'll never end up being the nominee. And they were completely wrong about all of those things, because whether they love him or hate him, people are still obsessed with Trump. But the much more important thing is, no, he's back. And I will tell you, even among my former colleagues, I was an outlier in that position. And he probably wouldn't care if I shared this, but I had a debate with my former boss, John Kelly, about it. And he was very sure that Donald Trump would not run again. And I said, Chief, I've got to take the exact opposite position. I can't imagine the scenario he doesn't run again, because the man has never seen a spectacle he didn't want to run into the center of. And what would be a bigger spectacle than threatening the nation again with his return? Of course he did. It was never a doubt in my mind. But that said, a cautious publisher will say, well, let's just call it the next Trump, just in case Trump's not the nominee. But look, he is the next Trump. And I think a Trump 2.0 would be vastly more dangerous than the first term. I can get into a lot of details on that, but I think the biggest takeaway would be this. In the book, I didn't want my voice to be the sole voice, because maybe you don't believe me, or maybe you think that by turning against Trump, I'm a traitor, or whatever reason, you would want to write off my testimonials from the administration. So I said, fine, I will go interview more people from the Trump administration than anyone out there who's written one of these books, and ask them one question. What did Donald Trump want to do in a first term that he didn't, that he would do in a second term? And I asked that question of cabinet secretaries in the Trump administration, all the way down to staff assistants who sat at the desk outside the Oval Office. And I will tell you, I arrogantly thought I knew what that portrait would look like that those people painted, and I was completely wrong. It was a lot starker than even I expected, because I heard about departments and agencies that I never interacted with when I was at DHS, or rarely, and their experiences with the former president, whether it was the Department of Veterans Affairs or the Department of Education, and some of the designs Trump had for those places that he did not implement only because he was worried he wouldn't win re-election. And the book goes into detail about those. I tried to paint the most vivid picture I could of what a second term would look like under him, or under the rule of a savvier successor. In the primaries, to your question, I don't think there is competition. I think Nikki Haley, sure, she's surging in New Hampshire right now. Statistically, it's a really difficult path. Even if everyone dropped out today and it was a head-to-head matchup, I think it's still hard math for her to become the nominee. But I always just point to, I point to the betting markets on this all the time, because I think we've really got to wake up about it. And I'll take you back to 2016. Who in here could tell me what the odds makers in Vegas said Donald Trump's odds were of being president in 2016? Anyone have a number? Just throw some out there. 20%? Anyone else?
100 to 1.
100 to 1. 9%. The odds maker said 9%, and he won. Just before I walked in, I looked. The odds makers have him at a 31% chance of winning the presidency. They're giving him 3 times the odds of winning the presidency now as he did just before he won the presidency. Do they have a crystal ball? Of course they don't. But what that is a very good barometer of is you all, is the public, is what people are thinking is possible. That, to me, is a very, very alarming thing, that the public essentially feels like he's got 3 times the chance of winning as he did before. So it's a very realistic prospect. But that said, there's still the route that Trump himself got the nomination, that other people could get the nomination. So by potentially, a Nikki Haley, for instance, by carving up a plurality of the vote in different places. She could cobble it together, others could, but I think we'll be dealing with him for sure as the major party nominee this coming year.
You're really bringing this room down, man. We're getting pretty depressed up here, but we're gonna.
I got good news coming. Back to Franklin to
Maybe
cheer
we'll
you
bring
guys
it up
up.
with Franklin. So in your 2 years of really embedded reporting, you really seem to change your position. You mentioned Bloviator. That's the way you describe him, the way you felt when you got to this, over the hill, rambled on too much, told the same corny stories. But then you shift. You start admiring his political skills because you write this in the prologue. Biden set out to prove the eternal relevance of politics. In fact, it was the way out of this mess. He wanted to show that deal-making, coalition building, persuading the other side were still effective ways to get things done. Given this current state of paralysis and dysfunction in Washington, do you still believe that compromise and consensus is even possible if he gets a second term?
I don't actually think, this is part of my misunderstanding about Joe Biden's conception of politics, is that I don't think that he necessarily thinks that that's the way you get things done, but there are technologies that he believes in as kind of, things that he wants to have as part of his toolbox. And also, even when he knows he's going to fail at certain aspects of that, there are things that he feels like he needs to pursue in order to preserve them for the sake of democracy. I would say that Joe Biden is somebody who, there's an element, I think, within the Democratic Party of kind of classism that he suffered from, that he was somebody who self-identifies really strongly as a child of the working class at a time when the elites in his party became Ivy League meritocrats. And when he was Obama's vice president, he really suffered from that. I mean, Obama and others in the Obama inner circle would roll their eyes whenever Joe Biden would start to talk and tell his corny stories. And the thing about Joe Biden is that he actually knows that that's happening. And he's somebody who's always been intensely insecure about people thinking that he's dumb. And that's part of the reason why he goes off and he tells these stories. He's trying to desperately win you over. I have to say that I kind of felt like I began with some of that classist bias against the guy at the outset. And what I realized is that there is, Joe Biden is somebody who is lived this life that is tragic and is also in certain ways really messy. And that messiness of Joe Biden is part of the reason why he can be effective at politics, is that he understands other people's ambitions, he understands other people's insecurities because he experiences them himself. So like if he's going into a meeting, I was watching as he was developing his strategy as it relates to Putin, which admittedly was not an effective strategy, but he knew that Putin felt disrespected by the way that Obama had treated him, that Obama had described Putin as the leader of an aging, declining power, and that Biden was always intent on at least according him the respect of feeling like he's the big man on campus. And so when they first met in Geneva in 2021, Biden had a whole theory about how you orchestrate it, where you don't do it on the sidelines of another summit. You have to meet him in a place that has all the trappings of a Cold War summit, and that he had a whole strategy, a whole picture in his head about the way that the guy works. And so when Biden, I guess one of the misconceptions that I feel like the world has about him now is because he's a terrible TV character, for all the reasons that are apparent to anybody who's seen him walk down the steps of Air Force One or seen him kind of talk his way through a news conference, does not mean that he's a disengaged president. What I saw up close was a guy who was engaged to a fault, that he can be a micromanager. He's somebody who ends up falling deep down policy holes and like wants to understand everything for himself. When he goes out for a press conference, he'll bring in an expert and then bring in another expert and bring in another expert, because in the end, he doesn't want to be the guy who looks stupid. He wants to have mastery over his material. And when he's meeting with one of his fellow politicians, he wants to be armed with the narrative detail that's in the specific data points that he can muster to be able to tell a story to them and to persuade them. And I think, just to tie it back to Trump, I feel, in Trump's lunacy, I feel like one of the great failings of media right now is that you look at Joe Biden's age and questions are raised about his mental acuity, which really means like the guy sometimes will struggle to find a name, or sometimes he'll tell a story that he'll get a little bit lost in. But that's not, it's being placed on the spectrum with Trump's own mental acuity issues. But forgetting somebody's name is different than being a lunatic. That should not exist on a spectrum.
That's a verified fact. But I'm going to stick with Putin because it's interesting to see how these two presidents, there was this weird bromance with Trump and Putin, and the experts feel that Trump got played by Putin. And there were all these whispers that they had some dirt on him or something. What was your sense? Homeland Security would obviously be interested. What was Trump's relationship with Putin, and what is it currently, do you think?
I don't think Trump got played by Putin, because that presumes that a trick was played on him. Trump wanted that close relationship with the Russians. Trump wanted the United States to do things that were in Russia's interests. So far from getting played, I think that, like you said, bromance. I mean, he very intentionally.
He wanted to be Putin. He wanted to be an autocrat.
He wanted to be an autocrat, and I got to tell you, I mean, there was no one in the world Trump waxed poetic about more than an autocrat. If it was Xi Jinping in Beijing, if it was Vladimir Putin in Moscow, if it was Kim Jong-un in Pyongyang, he desperately wanted what they had and he did not, which was unlimited power. That sounds so hyperbolic coming out of my mouth, but it was very much the truth. It's why one of the first things Donald Trump wanted to find out once he got into the White House was, what are the limits of my authority? And I've been harping on this for like 2 years, and I got really frustrated because people weren't paying attention, which was the insurrection was, to me, such an obvious culmination of these conversations I watched play out from the start of the Trump administration until the end, which was, he wanted to know, where are my authorities at their apex? Now, of course, those were not the words Donald Trump used. And he was told by the White House counsel's office, as he started to ask for the military to be used to solve problems that he was told couldn't be solved. Border, people coming across the border. Send the military down, turn them around. Protests in Portland. So you send the United States military in. White House counsel's office from early in the presidency said, there is a power, it is the Insurrection Act, and Mr. President, these circumstances that you're dealing with right now, they don't qualify under this old 19th century law to invoke the Insurrection Act, to allow the U.S. military to enforce domestic law on U.S. soil. Now, little tiny fun fact, the type of fun policy fact Joe Biden would be interested in and Donald Trump wouldn't. The Insurrection Act actually does get invoked with some frequency, usually in natural disasters. If you see the military participating and it's not the National Guard and it's other forces, sometimes that's what the president uses, is the Insurrection Act, and the lawyers authorize it in those crisis situations. Donald Trump wanted to use it for things that weren't relevant to that law, but he knew that this was his tool. He was mentally looking for circumstances that in his mind met the threshold of insurrection. And I know this firsthand because I was on the receiving end of orders from Trump to announce to you all that we, the United States, were going to invoke the Insurrection Act. In his State of the Union address in 2019, he was in the White House, downstairs near the map room, preparing on a teleprompter for the State of the Union address. And there was another caravan of migrants coming towards the border, and nothing could set Donald Trump into a mental death spiral like incoming migrants to the United States. You know, these heavily armed, very violent people who want to come be a part of the American experiment. Yeah, he had this vision of Rambos running towards the border when it's primarily women and children who want a better life, who are often fleeing violence and persecution. And so he says to us, we go down, he summons us to the White House, and he says, he doesn't know the words Insurrection Act. Too big of a word, too hard to remember. What he did say was, we need to use my magical powers. I'm not even kidding. I'm not even kidding. The magical powers was his parlance for, I would like to invoke the Insurrection Act. And we were in a bit of a panic because his comment was, I'm going to put it in the speech right now. I'm going to announce it in the State of the Union address that we're invoking this, and we're going to send the U.S. military to the border, and we're going to turn all of them around. We got to the White House counsel's office. We convinced them to talk the president off the ledge. It never made it into the speech. But I say that because by the time we got to January 6th, and folks started speculating on the 7th, what Donald Trump's motivations were, to me, it was manifestly obvious that this whole presidency, he'd been looking for a moment where he could say, this is the moment for me to validly invoke these powers, because look at these people. They're climbing over the U.S. Capitol, and I'm going to have to take control and maybe stop the election from power from being transferred. So I watched that play out, and that type of episode tells you, of course, all about not just the character of the man and his intent, but to tie it back to what I was saying at the beginning, who he wanted to be. And he wanted to be Putin, he wanted to be one of those autocrats, and from the beginning, that was one of the few hooks he knew of that could give him that power. And I will tell you, as his staff, we were terrified by that. And the last note that I would give is just, I remember a couple months into the administration, right after I joined, I was in New York City with John Kelly. We were flying back. I think he'd done a speech on the Intrepid. And we were on the plane, and there was something about Russian interference on the news. And Kelly looked at me, and I'm kind of looking to him for guidance about how to adapt to this environment. And he said, what do you think? Do you think he's in Putin's pocket? And that, a cabinet member to the president was asking me if he was in the pocket of a foreign despot, was so chilling to me. And I told Kelly what I tell people now, is I said, look, I don't think the president is spying for Russia, but I think he sees in those autocrats what he sees in himself, which is a desire for power, and he will cater to them because he knows that in his post-presidency, he'll find ways for it to benefit him financially, and perhaps through them, he can expand his power throughout the world.
I mean, you paint a very terrifying portrait with some horrifying incidents of what Trump would want to do. And Kelly, who you mentioned, he calls him, quote, a very, very evil man. Is Joe Biden the best hope to stop this menace, the orange menace? I mean, you call him the last politician. He's gotten some pretty remarkable things done in 3 years. I don't think he gets a lot of credit, but he's also very low in the polls. How can you explain an incumbent president trailing that hypothetical generic Democrat, which is shocking? And then the age factor, in 3 days he'll be 81. And in the polling, it just keeps coming up. Is he the best hope, or is it too late to look for somebody else who can stop Trump?
Well, politics is very rarely about our best hopes, sadly. And, are there better Democratic challengers out there? Yeah, I'm sure there are. I mean, Joe Biden's got he's got issues. But on the other hand, it seems like he's made this decision to run again, and by every measure, he should have a good story to tell. I know that, I tell in the book the story of the first 2 years where there is this raft of legislation that gets passed with a 1-vote majority in the Senate, and the 2 hinge votes in the Senate, who are Democrats, barely, are Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, both of whom are in the pockets of plutocrats and willing to do their bidding in various ways. And the fact that he was able to get these things over the line, ultimately, are incredible accomplishments. And then there are other parts of his presidency, and Bidenomics as a term is a terrible term. Like, nobody should want, people don't have warm feelings towards Joe Biden, I think, in the abstract, and they have complicated feelings about the economy. And so to own the economy so comprehensively in that sort of way doesn't make sense to me. But one of the interesting and very unexpected things about Joe Biden is that Joe Biden is a guy who comes from Delaware, and there was a sense that he was the senator from MBNA, which is one of the financial services companies that is based in Wilmington. And in his Senate career, you would have looked at him and said, this guy is a very pro-business Democrat who does Wall Street's bidding, in essence. But then what emerged in the course of his presidency is something very different than the Clinton-Obama legacy as it relates to economics. That you have this guy whose feelings about class cause him to associate with unions, and starting with the Amazon campaign in Alabama, where he more aggressively intervened in a union election than any president in history, up through the UAW strike, where he's the first president to walk a picket line. He's created an atmosphere that has helped restore the prestige of unions. But more fundamentally, Trump promised all these things as it relates to battling monopolies like big tech, or getting tough with China on trade, or restoring infrastructure and manufacturing. And scattered across these pieces of legislation is a legacy that actually makes good on Trump's populist promises. The government is now prosecuting Amazon and Google, and the proposed draft merger guidelines they have will remake American capitalism in really substantial sorts of ways. You look at the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS bill, the government has now made these decisions to direct the American economy so that we seize the commanding heights of the industry of the future, where every single device we have depends on these semiconductors. And the investments in green economy are the most substantial thing anybody in the world has really done to reduce climate emissions. And so there's a story to be told about what Bidenomics is actually. In fact, it's not just about low unemployment or low inflation numbers. And he made a very calculated decision at the beginning of his presidency to have an economy running at full employment. And inflation is, I think, one of the unfortunate side effects of that. But there are also a lot of benefits that come from having an economy where people have the stability of jobs. Joe Biden is haunted by the fact that his own father got fired a couple times and had a lot of issues where they slid down the social ladder. And he was determined not to have the country suffer the scarring effects of the 2008 financial crisis, where people were out of work for extended periods of time.
Thank you. And I did promise we're going to leave 15 or 20 minutes for audience questions. So if you have a question, you can come up to the microphones. And before we ask the first audience question, I would like each of you to pose a question, kind of author to author. You know each other's work. You kind of came at it from two different sides. Miles, what do you want to ask Franklin?
That's a good one.
Please come up to the microphone if you have a question. You'll get your first question if you're first to the mic.
I am really curious, your expertise in American politics, you being so close to watching this White House evolve, putting the presidential race aside for a moment, what gives you optimism right now in American politics?
I look at the course of the last couple of years, and I think there are a lot of ways in which government has actually succeeded, not just admirably, but beautifully. So you look at the response to the pandemic, which is something that we've all decided for legitimate reasons to subject to collective amnesia. But when the Biden people arrived in Washington, the workhorse vaccine was going to be Pfizer. And Trump hated Pfizer because Pfizer announced the results of its successful clinical trials after Trump's election. Pfizer did not take Operation Warp Speed money, and Trump did various things to penalize Pfizer for not taking that money. And so the Biden administration needed to both ramp up production of the vaccine, which they did by getting deeply involved in the inner workings of the supply chain and of the manufacturing process. They needed to introduce a plan to get shots into arms because the Trump administration didn't have a plan to do that. And within 6 months of coming into office, it was possible to stroll into a Walgreens or a CVS and get a shot that would save your life. I mean, it's one of the most successful government programs, and it happened so seamlessly and so effortlessly that everybody took it for granted. But government is still capable of doing extraordinary things.
That's a little optimism, a little. What do you want to ask Miles, Franklin?
Now let's bring it back down to earth a little bit.
Is it possible, you talked about how there was a plan there was an attempt at least, or a discussion to inoculate the government against the impending Trump presidency in 2017. Is there anything that could be done to inoculate the government from a Trump presidency in the year 2024?
Yeah. It's one of the things I write a little bit about in Blowback, and I hate to be the cynic here, but I think the window for a number of those things in the book has passed. I mean, I talk a little bit about first, the likelihood, or at least the significant possibility of his return to the White House, and the urgent need to fortify those guardrails of democracy. Because make no mistake, it will be a systematic effort, guardrail by guardrail of democracy, and by that I mean the checks and balances of the Senate and the judiciary and domestic security forces, to dismantle those guardrails. There's a number of things I think the U.S. Congress could have done, especially before the Republicans retook the House, to strengthen some of those institutions, to add additional checks. And I mean simple, practical things. For instance, the President of the United States comes into office and has about 4,000 positions he or she can fill throughout the government, which they often put political appointees into those jobs. We learned from the last administration that perhaps some of those jobs shouldn't be appointed by the president. I'd been a part of efforts to launch an agency called CISA, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. It's the agency where my good friend Chris Krebs was the Trump-appointed official who in 2020, when Trump said the election was stolen, he said, "Mr. President, I am your top elections official. It was the most secure election in modern history." And Trump fired him by tweet. I don't want Donald Trump to come back into office and appoint someone into that job. And so those are the types of things the U.S. Congress had a window to act on. We're now well past that window. I do think at this point it's not going to be up to the Congress. I don't think the guardrails will be better fortified. I think the onus is really going to be on the American people, first, to hopefully make the right decision, and second, upon those civil servants throughout government, on our justice system, and God forbid on our U.S. Congress, to try to hold a wayward chief executive accountable if he makes it back to the White House. So,
and that Congress would, if Trump gets elected, that Congress will likely be at least in large part half Republican, if not fully Republican, and not likely to hold him accountable.
And even if it's not, one of the really shocking things that I heard in my conversations was almost a certitude among Trump's allies that he would be willing to further circumvent the Congress in a second term, because he learned there's very few things Congress can do to enforce its edicts. And the example that I give in the book is a person who used to be a friend, who's no longer a friend, ended up becoming the acting Secretary of Homeland Security at the end of the Trump administration. A man named Chad Wolf, for 18 months, was your Secretary of Homeland Security. At the end of the administration, a federal judge concluded that Chad Wolf was unlawfully appointed to the role of Secretary of Homeland Security in violation of federal law because he wasn't confirmed by the US Senate. He was in that temporary capacity vastly longer than he was allowed to be. And do you know what the consequences were? There were not consequences.
So maybe magical powers actually do exist.
Well, so just to put a bow on that, sadly, is that they learned a very direct lesson from that. And there are plans in place if a cabinet member is not confirmable to put them in anyway and to dare Congress and the judicial system to stop them. Because what can they do?
Thank you. We have a questioner, and this microphone is open. If you want to come over here, we'll go side to side, but go ahead, your first question.
My question is two-part. Is where are the people like you who know what you know, who know how dangerous Donald Trump is? And why do they not have the courage that you had to speak out and warn us and educate those people who really don't know and think he may be the savior?
I could be deeply critical of some of the folks who I'd wish had spoken out and didn't. And I'd be lying if I told you I didn't have a good deal of frustration and disappointment in some of those folks. In fact, it's the greatest professional disappointment of my life, is watching so many people I looked up to share the same opinion about the man and not do anything about it. And in fact, when I came into the Department of Homeland Security, that front office, I'm just going to list some people. You'll know some of these names, but maybe not others. It was John Kelly, Kirstjen Nielsen, myself, Chad Wolf, Gene Hamilton, Elizabeth Newman, Olivia Troy. It's this core group of people. All those people I just mentioned shared the same view of the President of the United States they were working under, that he was quite obviously unhinged, unqualified for his job at best, and at worst a danger to the fabric of our republic, which were the words of Jim Mattis when he was Secretary of Defense. We all shared that view. Those 7 people, some of us ended up quitting in protest and speaking out. Some of those people stayed silent and retreated into obscurity, and some of them tripled down on Donald Trump and became supplicants until the last day of the administration. Correction, remain supplicants to that man. And it confounds me to this day why they demonstrated such complete and total cowardice in the face of a threat to the fabric of our republic by staying silent. I said I wasn't going to criticize them. I clearly just did. But I want to give you an actual answer to your question, but I'm not going to answer it. I'm going to, if you'll indulge me for 60 seconds, I'm going to let other people answer that question for you.
Evil, and you're going to go down. You might. What you're doing to President Trump is disgusting. You are disgusting people. You're evil, and you're going to go down. You, my friend, are a piece of shit. You are a traitor.
You're pushing for anti-Trump? You dumb motherfucker. We will squash you like a fucking peanut, bitch. You're done. You're done. So eat a dick and die.
Miles, we're going to dox you. You're not going to be able to walk down the street. You're an anti-American. Leave the country. You're not welcome here anymore. You're anti-American. You hate your country. Get out.
Because you will deserve the wrath of hell, and I think you will get what's coming to you. God willing.
I could go on and on. These are the voicemails I get. So in answer to your question, the reason more people aren't speaking out, part of it's cowardice. Part of it is the political intimidation and violence we're seeing in this country.
Wow. We'll have Mimi, you were waiting there, and then we'll go to Frank here. Go ahead.
Okay. Miles, first, I've read all your books, so...
So we've spent a lot of time together, you and I.
I'd like that. Obviously, I am alarmed. I think everyone probably in this room is alarmed. But the people that I speak with, and this is a question, are like, oh, politics, I don't pay attention, I can't pay attention. And that's what alarms me, is that the attrition of people who actually vote is really going to affect the next election because of everybody's distastefulness. What can we do here? What can we all do to get people to pay attention to this critical moment in American history?
If you'll indulge me, I want to split the question with Franklin, because I think he's probably going to have even better answers than me. But my quick stab at it would be, and I'm going to steal this from someone else. A couple of weeks ago, I came to New York City to speak at, there was a Stop Trump Summit that the National Review put on. And Robert De Niro was supposed to come, and I was super excited about it because I was going to get to interview him. And then he got COVID, and I got that phone call, and I thought, that's a BS Hollywood excuse. And then he called me, and he had COVID. The guy was really sick, and he dictated to me what he wanted to say, and so I read his remarks to the crowd. And he ended his speech with an exhortation to everyone there that I was kind of surprised by. He said, I think the best thing you can do to keep this guy from getting in the White House is open your arms to the Republicans that you know that have voted for him in the past. Do not treat them like they are him. They are not him. They are Americans who are frustrated. They probably don't know a ton about politics. They're restless. They've maybe been in the Republican tribe for a whole time, but he said, do not demean them. Open your arms to them. And he went further than I would have in those remarks. And I don't think Robert De Niro was ever a Republican. And that was impressive to me because I think one of the main reasons Joe Biden won in 2020 is that just enough Republicans defected and voted for him. And statistically in the swing states, it was about 6 to 7% of Republicans who had voted for Trump in 2016, voted for a Democrat for the first time in their lives and supported Trump. To the extent that you can give them the air cover to do that again, I think it'll be the greatest service you could do to this country.
I actually think that, so when I look at the polls, I just have a couple reactions. One is, people don't need, everybody knows who Donald Trump is. If you don't know who Donald Trump is at this point, you're probably not worthy of citizenship. It's just, I don't know if exposure is necessarily the problem. I think that, especially I look at the polls right now, the one thing that I see is that a lot of the Republicans who voted for Biden in 2020 are still he's still doing quite well with those voters, surprisingly well with those voters. A lot of Joe Biden's problem occurs with the base of the Democratic Party, which I think needs to grow up. Because, you may have your quibbles with Joe Biden, and those quibbles may be 100% justified, but the alternative is a guy who's talking about concentration camps and mass deportation of immigrants. And my optimistic hope is that as that choice settles in and people remember exactly the stakes of the election, then people won't behave idiotically.
Thank you. Frank, and then who else wants a question? Come on up. This is your opportunity. Microphone's open there, but go ahead, Frank.
Well, what I was going to ask has basically just kind of been answered. But the question that has bugged me to no end is, how do you get through to the Trump voters and get them to see what seems so obvious to our faces?
Yeah. Each of you.
Look, it's going to be really hard to win MAGA voters over in this election, and I don't think De Niro in his remarks, and certainly in mine, I don't mean to suggest that we're going to convert the hardcore believers. In most contexts, it's sort of a lost cause to go try to convert hardcore believers. But I do think these folks on the fence, not just moderates, but disaffected Republicans, can be mobilized. I think it's important to. But one of the things that reaches them is, in politics, what we call permission structures, which is just a fancy way of saying, look, if there's other people in the tribe who are willing to buck the tribal leader, it makes it easier for you. And I think this cycle, people like me aren't going to be useful. Like, we're coded now as, being liberals. Someone on the Republican side looks at me and they say, he's not a conservative anymore. He went against Trump. I think we need fresh faces to turn against Trumpism, and I think that helps give air cover to those voters. That's what I hope to see. But I also think just real stories, actual storytelling helps. I play those voicemails for you guys not to get sympathy, but because it's important for people to see how real and violent this is getting. And no matter how much you're committed to your candidate or the other, I find a lot of folks are sort of willing to say, ooh, okay, people are threatening to kill your pregnant sister. You lost your home, your job, and your marriage and your personal security because you spoke out against this guy. That's not right. That's not what America's about. And I think we need more folks talking really candidly about that, because public service has gotten very vitriolic, and the data also shows it. Death threats against members of Congress increased tenfold from the year Trump took office to the year he left. Now a majority of poll workers say they feel threatened on the job. These are things that weren't the case a few years ago. These are numbers we've never seen before in modern American politics. And I think telling those stories will help show people there's something bigger than their candidate and partisan politics, and help them put country over party.
Franklin, do you want to add anything?
We can, that was good.
Okay.
We workshopped that together.
Yeah. Go ahead, Gene.
Okay, Mr. Foer.
Yes.
President Biden, when I ever see him, it's in tightly scripted, tightly controlled public events. Knowing him as you do, why doesn't he ever have a presidential press conference, and would you advise him to have presidential press conferences where he could show that he could speak on his feet?
Yeah, at this stage, I would say go for it, because I've been able to visit with him twice off the record, and I could tell you, Joe Biden does a lot of self-editing in public, because if you have a reputation for being a gaffe machine, if that's all you read about yourself in the press, and you're the president of the United States, and if you misspeak in any sort of way, then it's going to become a global headline that'll move markets and make people feel insecure or whatever. You become very cautious about how you present yourself in public. And so, to a certain extent, I think it's an admirable quality of his that he's aware, he's self-conscious enough of this characterological flaw that he has, that he's trying to insulate himself from it. But on the other hand, I also know that if you listen to him talk about China right now, if Joe Biden was sitting up here instead of one of us, and you asked him, so what's your China strategy? He would say, okay, I'm doing this thing with the Australians as it relates to like a military security. I'm doing this thing to combat the Belt and Road Initiative. I'm doing this thing in order to flip Modi in India, and I've been able to, without anybody really getting paying a lot of attention to it, broker a rapprochement between the Japanese and the South Koreans, and he'd be able to show you how all the pieces on the chessboard fit together. And I chronicle a couple things in my book. One of which is the relationship with China, where he does have this relationship with Xi that goes back some distance, and then also the way that he's thought about the Ukraine war. Now, one of the scoops in my book is that he's had a terrible relationship with Vladimir Zelensky over time, and Zelensky was somebody Biden's been involved in Ukrainian politics longer than Zelensky. I mean, it's just true. It's like, and then, so when Zelensky first showed up in the White House, Biden thought, this guy is a piker. He doesn't know what he doesn't, he was, I have this meeting where I describe where Zelensky is asking him about NATO membership, and Biden is kind of like, you're not going to get that. And then Zelensky said various other things that really left Biden unimpressed with him. But the tension in their relationship is fundamentally that Zelensky, who is a skilled communicator, is able to speak over the heads of Western politicians and to apply pressure to Western politicians to do more than they feel comfortable doing. And even though Biden has gone way out of his way to give the Ukrainians this extraordinary cache of arms that they've been able to use to fend off Russian invasion and succeed in the first counteroffensive, and then also will ultimately protect the integrity of the Ukrainian state over the long run when they have better air defenses and the like, which take time to ramp up, Biden has also asked the question in every meeting, will this contribute to an increased risk of nuclear war? What's the possibility of Putin escalating in response to this move? And I'm somebody who is a Ukraine hawk, and it frustrates me, but I also appreciate that the President of the United States is asking questions about nuclear war and about the dangers of escalation. And I think what's impressive is how with China and with Ukraine, he's been able to apply lots of pressure to autocratic leaders to move very aggressively, both diplomatically and militarily, without sending us over the rails in a way that could cause these things to explode. And that's the product of his experience, and it's the product of being somebody who's just thought a lot about foreign policy over time and who trusts himself in that sort of regard. I wish he trusted himself a little bit more with regard to taking questions from the press and engaging in that sort of way. But unfortunately, I think in his own head, he's got lots of evidence to the contrary that he does go off the rails in those instances.
Thank you. Right here.
Hi. First off, I want to say I appreciate both your perspectives and also appreciate the Writers Institute for having you. I wanted to see if either of you had some thoughts about the no-label situation. If there was a ticket that was a combination Democrat-Republican, could that ever fly? I guess this is my mind trying to think of the creative option. I also wonder, could there ever be a situation where Biden could become more attractive if he chose a different VP? My personal concern being, I don't know that Kamala Harris quite has the foreign policy experience, so that would worry me if something ever happened to Biden. So my mind, I guess, is turning out, is there any other option here? And also thinking a lot about, there's a lot of, I think, people so tired of the polarization that would maybe welcome a moderate path forward. So just wondering your thoughts in that ballpark.
What'd you say your name was? No, really?
Oh, my name's Julie Heslin-Poca.
Julie?
Yes, Julie.
You and I are very similar because I, after 2020, went down this path. Oh, I hope some people boo me when I say this, but I was running a political organization trying to swing the pendulum back to the center in the Republican Party. Another catastrophic failure. Clearly, we did a very bad job of that the past couple of years. It was like me and Adam Kinzinger and some others, and we've failed spectacularly to do that. And so I started looking at third-party options, and I merged my group into Andrew Yang's Forward Party. But before you boo. One of the things I convinced Andrew to do with that effort, they're doing an experimental effort to try to support independent candidates. I made them promise they wouldn't run a presidential candidate in 24 because my fear, as badly as I as an American, I really want to see an independent president. First independent president since George Washington. Sounds pretty cool. I think we need that right now. I think it would be wonderful to have. But this election, the data shows us that in most scenarios you play out, it tends to benefit Donald Trump. It tends to pull from Joe Biden. And that's a risk I'm not willing to take. It's why I made Forward pledge not to run someone. I met with the No Labels people about 18 months ago. I sat with Nancy Jacobson, who runs the organization, and her biggest donors in the United States Capitol as they had conversations about this. And it made me very worried that they weren't seriously thinking about how they might give Donald Trump a fast pass to the presidency. That said, putting aside this election, if I look at a 20-year time horizon, I see the possibility for very interesting creative destruction in the American political system, and I mean that in a positive way. Gen Zers are the most independent politically generation we've seen in a half century, and more Americans than at any point since polling began say they are political independents today than they ever have. That to me is not a scary thing. I think it's a remarkable thing, something that we haven't yet seen the fruits of. I think there is the possibility. There's one word people use in polls to describe their politics more than almost any other, and that's moderate. Most Americans do see themselves as sensible, and I don't think that moderate majority is really represented right now in our politics, and that's got to change at some point.
A couple things. One, I think if you looked at the Biden record, it is pretty moderate at the end of the day. I mean, it's not there. It began in a way that was much more ambitious, that you could have said was leaned significantly to the left. But thanks to Joe Manchin, most of those left-wing parts of the agenda were culled from the program, and the result was something that I think is pretty moderate, that there's a lot of bipartisan consensus around most of the economic agenda that he passed. A lot of his bills were bipartisan. The other thing that I would say is that Kamala Harris, I think, has gotten, my book describes their relationship, which is a very complicated relationship. One of the things, the vice president is the premise for a comic show on HBO. The vice presidency is a premise for a comic show on HBO. And the only thing harder than being a vice president is being a former vice president's vice president. And there's a lot of, whether Joe Biden, who I think is mostly a nice guy, means to treat her in a sadistic sort of way, there are moments where that kind of invariably happens. But and clearly politically she's struggled. That when you listen to her make her case, it feels like she's engaged in the same process of self-editing that Joe Biden is engaged in, and it muffles her message. But when it comes to experience, she's now as experienced as it relates to foreign policy as pretty much anybody who could assume the presidency. And I've asked a lot of questions constantly to people, what is she like in meetings? And invariably the response is she asks really smart questions. She comes in like, she's as prepared as anybody who enters into the room. And she's capable of actually, because she has this prosecutor's background, really driving at somebody who's telling her something and asking questions in a kind of relentless sort of way that gets different sort of answers. And while I think a lot of the press coverage of her is fair, I think that there's this point at which we've reached where she's kind of descended into this caricature that ceases to really relate to the person herself.
Thank you. So we have 2 questions left. If you can ask them quickly in succession, then you'll answer them together, because I want to leave, promise, 10, 15 minutes to stretch your legs, to buy a book, to get some fresh air. The bathrooms are down the hall. But let's ask the 2 questions, and then they'll answer after you've both asked.
Thanks, Paul. You both got experience from the inside with people. We just heard some phone calls that to me sounded like sincere anger and hate, not somebody who was just playing, unless a really good actor. So how do you deal with, or what insights can you give us into, how did these people change? Do you think they changed from before, where they thought this is terrible, to some people who called Trump every name they could think of and now act like he's the savior? Could they really have drunk some Kool-Aid, and we have to understand that they need an exorcism more than they need reason?
Thank you. And the last question quickly here.
Hi, thank you for being here. We're talking a lot about personalities here, and that's a major, major focus. But there are other issues like gerrymandering and issues with the Electoral College and so forth. And I just wonder if you see a future where some of that stuff becomes a little more workable than what I see it as currently doing.
To the first question, I would say that most of my career in national security was focused on counterterrorism. I went into government post 9/11 because I wanted to stop a day like that from happening again, and really worked on those issues up to and including through the rise of ISIS. And one of the things I learned working in that space is the US government, we lit billions of dollars on fire to come to an answer to this question of how do you de-radicalize someone. Just billions and billions of dollars, and reached a pretty simple conclusion, which is that the most effective de-radicalization efforts are community off-ramps. In other words, the closer to the subject, the more effective you can be in pulling someone away from conspiracies and violent and hate. And I'm talking here about really the most heavily radicalized folks in the MAGA movement. And there is you cannot object to the data showing a spike in far-right violence, and I mean organized violence, people who intend to kill fellow Americans to intimidate them for political purposes, which is definitionally terrorism. That's a big threat right now. Domestic terrorism is a big threat. How do you de-radicalize those folks? It starts in the community. It starts even closer than that. It often starts with family members. And when we saw instances of terrorists that were effectively demobilized from the global war on terror and de-radicalized, it was often because there were people from within the Muslim community who made a compelling case against militant Islamist ideology that organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS promoted, and they were most effective when they were in the community, in community mosques. How does that translate? And I'm sure I'll get whacked for comparing Republicans to ISIS and Al-Qaeda, so bring it on, Twitter. But I think you have to think about that frame within the Republican Party. So it's likely not going to start here in this room. It's much more likely going to start somehow within a breakaway segment of the Republican Party that creates an off-ramp. And that's through normal politics. There doesn't need to be a de-radicalization program created. Wouldn't hurt. But you know, a Nikki Haley, you know, winning in the GOP, I'll be honest, could be a good pathway if she had the nomination to start giving people an off-ramp out of the core MAGA ideology. So that's the first question. To the second question, I would just say, I'm actually very bullish on the prospect of those basket of democracy reforms. And the thing I would compare it to is a little bit like we've seen with gay marriage or marijuana legalization. Those were efforts that were sort of multi-decade efforts, 20 to 30 years. If you look on a graph, it was a couple states, Everyone said, those hippies, the rest of the country's not going to do it. And then you see a spike and you see adoption. I think we're on a similar pathway with a range of those democracy forms, efforts to combat gerrymandering, efforts to open up primaries, to make our politics competitive and interesting again. And I'd like to think that, you know, in the next decade is probably in the 2030s that we're seeing more widespread adoption, but I actually think that will have a very positive effect on American politics. And I think that benefits all sides of the political spectrum to see politics become competitive again, because in a country where 95% of members of Congress who decide to run for re-election win, that's not a very competitive system. So I'm a big fan of trying those. Some of those experiments will fail, and that's okay. But I feel optimistic about that.
Thank you. Franklin, do you want to add a few things?
I'll be quick, because I'm really, on both of those questions, where I've been the more optimistic guy up here, I'm not really terribly optimistic on either of those fronts. I don't see a popular movement for electoral reform happening. I see some technocratic experimentation, but in order, just you look at the history of American political reform, usually there needs to be some grassroots movement that drives that, and that hasn't materialized. And as it relates to radicalization, I've just take the last 24 hours where you see Trump celebrating, in effect, and mocking Paul Pelosi for getting savagely attacked in his own home by a deranged follower of his. You look at the way in which we become inured to so much of the racism that's associated with Trumpism, but the way in which Elon Musk, Charlie Kirk, Tucker Carlson, and the last 48 hours have opened up the Pandora's box of anti-Semitism in a fresh sort of way, where they take this thing that's been percolating since, well before Charlottesville, but that was marked by Charlottesville, that was about the Soros conspiracy theories that Fox News promoted, where Jews are the handmaidens of wrecking white Christian society by importing black and brown people. This is the protocols of the elders of Zion transposed to American politics, filtered through the language and rhetoric of Donald Trump. It's like things are actually getting worse, and they will be worse, because Trump didn't talk about concentration camps for immigrants the last time around. He didn't have, I'm just quoting you back to you, he didn't have plans for wrecking the civil service so that he could install cronies across the government who will be corrupt, and also there will not be that sort of deep state resistance to Trumpism the second time around. It's going to get worse.
We flip positions from the optimist and the pessimist during this panel, but I want to just close with...
It's what happens when I'm up on stage with you. It's like pessimism is a contagion. It's bringing me down.
I just want to close with one thing, which is this, and maybe this is a little too philosophical for the moment tonight, but I tell my friends that I call myself an optimistic fatalist, and anyone who's taken philosophy is like, what the hell does that mean? You need to take more philosophy. But what I mean by that is, look, nature destroys everything that it creates. That applies as much to a tree as it does to a democracy, as it does to a planet. Demise is inevitable, but nature also creates everything from something that it's destroyed. And I think as a country, we need to look at the wreckage we're seeing in our political system and not just be so damn defeated by it every day, but see it as an opportunity. See it as an opportunity for whether it's those basket of democracy reforms or new ways of thinking about politics. We will create something from this wreckage, and that has been the motive power of all successful societies throughout all of human existence, and it can continue to be. So I think we should be optimistic.
Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will.
So.